Hey everybody, today I want to talk about acid-base balance in the body and how chemical buffers, the respiratory system and urinary system, or the kidneys, are used to regulate this variable. But first, let's briefly review what acids and bases are. So first of all, acids are substances that release hydrogen ions into solution. So hydrochloric acid is an example of an acid because when you put it in water, it dissolves and not only releases free chloride ions, but it releases free hydrogen ions into solution. And why is this important? Well, it's important or it's relevant because it's the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution that determines the acidity of that solution. So the more hydrogen ions you have in a solution, the more acidic it becomes. The opposite of acids are bases. Acids release hydrogen ions into solution. Bases are substances that take up hydrogen ions from solution. Sodium hydroxide is a good example of a base because when you put it in water, it dissolves not only into sodium ions, but into hydroxyl ions. And these hydroxyl ions are what make it a base because what they do is the hydroxyl ions bind with free hydrogen and convert it into water. And so they're essentially taking free hydrogen out of the solution and binding it up in water. Now you may know this already, but we measure how acidic or basic a solution is with the pH scale. So the pH scale is going to measure the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. And the official formula for pH is the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. This scale ranges from 0 all the way up to 14, with pH 7 being neutral. So my question for you is, if a solution is acidic, does it move closer to 0? Or does it move closer to 14? And the answer to that is it moves closer to 0. Solutions that are acidic are less than 7 pH. So they're anywhere from 7 or less than 7 all the way down to 0. And this picture illustrates this nicely. Here we have an acidic solution, and it's acidic because it has a high concentration of free hydrogen ions in solution. That means that solutions that are basic are greater than 7. And again, this is a nice picture down here, and it's basic because it only has a couple hydrogen ions in it. It has a low concentration of hydrogen ions in it. And the reason that's the case is because it has all these hydroxyl ions. And these hydroxyl ions, like I showed previously, bind to the free hydrogens and convert it into water. So why is it that the body maintains tight control over acid-base balance? And it does maintain tight control over this variable. Arterial blood is about pH 7.4, so a little bit basic. Venous blood, interstitial fluid, about 7.35, and the fluid within the cells, the intracellular fluid, is about 7.0. And if you get out of this variable, just out of this range just a little bit, you can get into either acidosis or alkalosis, and things can start going pretty wrong pretty quickly. So the question is, why does the body maintain such tight limits over this variable? And really it has to do with proteins. Proteins need a proper pH to maintain their 3D or their tertiary structure. That's the form that they need to be in to be able to function. So if you remember, a protein is a string of amino acids that folds back on itself. And it folds back on itself because of intermolecular forces and chemical bonds that form between the amino acid side chains. And this is what causes it to have its three-dimensional shape. And again, a protein needs to be in its three-dimensional shape to be able to function. Examples of proteins in the body enzymes, antibodies, hormones, hemoglobin within red blood cells. All of these need to be in their three-dimensional structure to be able to function. And what happens is that if you start getting a little bit too acidic or a little too basic, these chemical bonds and these intermolecular forces start to break. And the protein unravels into, it goes from its tertiary structure down to its primary structure. And a protein is not able to function in that primary structure. So all of a sudden the enzymes aren't working, the antibodies aren't working, hemoglobin's not working, and the bodies start to shut down. And when a protein goes from its three-dimensional to its primary structure, we call that a denaturing of the protein. Now, there's one other variable that the body maintains tight limits over to maintain the three-dimensional structure of proteins, and I'm wondering if you can guess what that is. So acid-base balance is very important for maintaining protein three-dimensional structure. What's the other variable that the body maintains tight limits over to maintain the structure of proteins? Body temperature. We maintain tight limits over that, and if the body starts to get too hot or too cold, then again those proteins can start to denature. And that's why high fevers can be really deadly, because the proteins start to denature and the body starts to shut down. So how does the body maintain pH balance? Well, there are three sequential ways that the body uses to maintain pH balance. The first are chemical buffers. These are the first line of defense. They're found in the fluids of the body, and these are going to act instantly to resist changes in pH. So the benefit, the upside is that they work immediately to resist changes in pH, but overall they have a limited overall buffering ability. Let's go back and let's just define what a buffer is. A buffer is a solution or chemical that resists changes in pH. So these chemical buffers that are located in the fluids of the body are going to resist changes in pH. After the chemical buffers, the respiratory system kicks in. And the respiratory system kicks in within minutes, 1 to 3 minutes. And the respiratory system kicks in to resist changes in pH. And what's it going to do? It's going to change respiratory rate and depth to try to correct that acid-base imbalance. And then lastly, we have the urinary system, and specifically the kidneys. So these are considered renal mechanisms. And the kidneys are the body's most potent acid-base regulatory system. They're the most powerful acid-base regulatory system. They can do the most to get pH back to where it needs to be. The downside, however, is that it takes hours or days for this to do so. But again, the kidneys have the largest buffering capacity. So now what I want to do is just go through each of these three different mechanisms that the body uses to maintain pH balance. And again, the first one are chemical buffers. And the most important chemical buffer system in the body is the carbonic acid-Bicarbonate buffer system. This is carbonic acid, H2CO3, and this is bicarbonate, HCO3-. And these chemical buffers, like I mentioned earlier, are found in the fluids of the body. They're found in the blood, they're found inside the cells, and I presume in the interstitial fluid as well. So how does this system resist changes in pH? Well, let's say first of all that we have an acidic situation. The body is too acidic. And it's too acidic because it has too many hydrogen ions in solution. What happens if there's too many hydrogen ions in solution? That's going to bind, that free hydrogen is going to bind to bicarbonate. It's going to get converted to carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid is going to get converted to CO2 and H2O. So essentially, we're taking free hydrogen ions and we're binding them up in water. And that brings the pH back to where it needs to be. An important principle that is that's regulating all of this is called Le Chatelier's principle. And basically what that means is that a chemical equation will shift to restore its equilibrium. So if there's too many chemicals on this side of the equation, then that means that the equation is going to shift this way to correct that imbalance. And as I just showed, if there's too many chemicals on this side of the equation, then it's going to shift the opposite way to restore that equilibrium. All right, well, here's how that buffer system deals with both acidic and basic situations. This is the one I just talked about. Here we have an acidic situation, so the pH is low, which means there's lots of hydrogen ions. So there's an excess of hydrogen ions in solution. Again, that's going to, because of Le Chatelier's principle, that's going to cause the equation to move this way. That hydrogen is going to bind to bicarbonate, form carbonic acid, and then eventually form CO2 and H2O. So that free hydrogen ion is being bound up into water, and it's taking free hydrogen ion out of solution. It's a little less, let's see. Okay, what if the body fluids are too alkaline, they're too basic, the pH is too high? That means that we have few hydrogen ions and lots of hydroxyl ions, and so we need to increase the amount of hydrogen ions to make it more acidic, to bring it back into balance. So what happens if we have too many hydroxyl ions, that's going to combine with carbonic acid, which is going to be converted into bicarbonate and water. And by taking hydroxyl ions out of the solution, we're allowing more free hydrogen ions to exist, I think is how that works. The next way to regulate acid-base balance is through respiratory mechanisms, through the respiratory system. And the respiratory system is going to do this by changing breathing patterns. It's going to change the respiratory rate and the respiratory depth in order to maintain pH balance. And just to give you a little review on how breathing or pulmonary ventilation works, breathing is caused by the contraction and relaxation of respiratory muscles, in particular the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles in between the ribs are the two main respiratory muscles. And when these muscles contract, here's the diaphragm in the relaxed state, and when it contracts, it actually flattens out, and that increases the volume of the thoracic cage, increases the volume of the lungs, and that allows air to move into the lungs. And then the diaphragm relaxes, the volume in the lungs goes down, which means the pressure goes up, and that forces air out. And so it's these respiratory muscles that control breathing. And the commands from these respiratory muscles come from respiratory centers that are located in the brainstem, specifically in the medulla oblongata is the main respiratory center. Now let's look at a common imbalance, pH imbalance, that can be caused by exercise and how the respiratory system kicks in to correct that. So we're going to look at the involvement of the respiratory system during a period of exercise when the pH gets off. So what are we looking at here? Well, here we are in the systemic tissues. This is a capillary with a red blood cell inside of it. And here we can see oxygen attached to hemoglobin. And when it gets to the tissues that it wants to drop that off at, the oxygen dissociates from hemoglobin and it moves by simple diffusion from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure into the systemic tissues. And we're just going to pretend like these cells here are skeletal muscles. They don't look like it, but let's just pretend like these are skeletal muscles. So what do these cells do with this oxygen? That's a good general biology question. Why are we delivering oxygen to these cells, to these skeletal muscles? What are they going to do with it? Well, oxygen is required for cellular respiration, taking glucose and converting it to adenosine triphosphate to ATP, which is the chemical form of energy that these cells need to do their work. So during a period of exercise, the skeletal muscles require a lot of ATP to be able to contract and to be able to do what they're going to do. Then we see carbon dioxide being produced from these cells and moving by simple diffusion from the cells into the interstitial fluid and inside the capillary. And my question is, why is CO2 being produced by these cells, by these skeletal muscle cells? Well, CO2 is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So we take glucose and oxygen, and it gets converted to ATP, to carbon dioxide, and also to water. All right, so what do you think happens to the amount of CO2 that is being produced by these skeletal muscle cells during a period of exercise, during a period of heightened activity? Well, that level of CO2 is going to go up considerably because the cells are, cellular respiration is happening at a faster rate, so the cells require more glucose, more oxygen, they're producing more ATP, but they're also producing more carbon dioxide. Why is that a problem? Well, that carbon dioxide goes into the blood and it gets exposed to the carbonic acid-Bicarbonate buffer system. Here we can see that buffer system, both in the plasma and inside the cell. So if we have a high amount of CO2, that's going to shift the equation this way. And so what we're going to end up doing is producing a high amount of free hydrogen ion. And if we have high levels of hydrogen ion, that's going to cause the fluids of the body to become acidic, and that's a problem. So here we go. Here it is down here. We increase the amount of CO2. That's going to shift the equation this way. Means we increase the amount of free hydrogen ions, and that causes the pH to become acidic. And that's the problem. So the question now is, how does the respiratory system kick in to solve this pH imbalance? Well, not surprisingly, there are sensory receptors located in the body that detect levels of both hydrogen ion and CO2. And specifically, we have what are called peripheral chemoreceptors. These are located in the aortic arc, and I believe these are the carotid arteries that go up to the head that are going to detect levels of hydrogen ion and CO2. We also have what are called central chemoreceptors that are also going to detect levels of these chemicals, and these are located in the brainstem. Okay, so what happens next? So levels of hydrogen ion and also CO2 both increase during a period of exercise. And that information is detected by these sensory receptors and it's taken to the brainstem. What happens next? Well, let's look at this figure over here. Here we have an increase in arterial CO2 during exercise. this is going to decrease the pH in the extracellular fluid of the brain, and that's going to be detected by these central chemoreceptors. They're going to detect these high levels of hydrogen ion. At the same time, let's see if we can move this up here. These peripheral chemoreceptors are going to detect levels of CO2, these elevated levels of CO2. So the central and peripheral chemoreceptors are both detecting this imbalance in hydrogen ion and CO2. And what do? They send that information to the brainstem, and specifically to those respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata. And what do you think the respiratory centers are going to do in response? How are the respiratory centers going to correct this problem? Well, they're going to increase their firing of action potentials to the respiratory muscles, which is going to increase ventilation. It's going to increase the rate and the depth of breathing. And what's the whole point of that? Well, by increasing ventilation, we're exhaling more CO2. And that's going to bring arterial CO2 and pH back to normal. And let's just apply it to the equation here. So we increase our respiratory rate and respiratory depth. That means we're going to exhale more CO2. So the CO2 levels in the body are decreasing. That's going to cause the equation to shift to the left to correct for that. So we're going to have free hydrogen ions that bind to bicarbonate. And again, they're going to get bound up in H2O, into water. So by exhaling more CO2, the equation shifts to the left and more free hydrogen is converted to water, and that brings the pH back to where it needs to be. So with this in mind, it's not surprising that anything that impairs respiratory function can cause imbalances in acid-base balance. They can cause acid-base imbalances. And when the respiratory system is the problem, so when respiratory system problems cause the pH imbalance, this condition is known as either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. So let's take a look at each of these. Let's first look at respiratory acidosis. And these are three situations that can cause respiratory acidosis. Impaired lung function. Impaired lung function due to chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, emphysema, cystic fibrosis, stuff like that. Impaired ventilatory movement, for if you have a chest injury or something that causes paralysis of the respiratory muscles, or certain drugs or injury to the brainstem that affects those medullary respiratory centers can result in a depression of respiratory activity. What all of these have in common is that they cause hypoventilation. Ventilation, breathing, hypo, a low amount of. So hypoventilation is a decrease in the rate and depth of breathing. And how does that result in acidosis? Well, if you have a decrease in pulmonary ventilation, that means that levels of CO2 in the body are going to, what are they going to do? They're going to go up because we're not expelling enough out. That's going to cause the equation to shift to the right, and it's going to cause the accumulation of free hydrogen ions in the body. So that's going to result in respiratory acidosis. Pretty much anything that causes hypoventilation can result in respiratory acidosis. And here you can see the symptoms of respiratory acidosis. But if this is the case, how's the body going to correct for it? The chemical buffers are actually kind of part of the problem in this case, because they're shifting to cause the increase in hydrogen ions, and the respiratory system is out of commission. And so how are we going to correct this? Well, this is where the kidneys are going to come into play. And we haven't talked about the kidneys' role yet, but the kidneys are going to work to correct this imbalance caused by the respiratory disease. And so when the kidneys are going to kick in, you're going to see high levels of CO2 in the body, and this is because of the hypoventilation, but you're also going to see high levels of bicarbonate. It's the high levels of carbon dioxide that causes the acidosis, but the rising or the elevated levels of bicarbonate are the kidney's response to offset this acidosis. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but you can imagine why that's going to happen. If we have too much hydrogen ion, the kidneys are going to increase the amount of bicarbonate. That's going to cause the equation to shift back this way. And it's going to take that free hydrogen and again bind it up in water to help restore that pH balance. What about respiratory alkalosis? So this is when the body is too basic and the problem or the cause has to do with the respiratory system. So pretty much in this case, anything that causes hyperventilation can cause respiratory alkalosis. So hyperventilation is an elevation or an increase in the rate or the depth of breathing. And so in this case, you're exhaling too much CO2, so the levels of CO2 in the body go down, causes the equation to shift to the left, and so too much free hydrogen is being bound up in water. And so that's going to cause the fluids of the body to become basic. And here are some different ways that hyperventilation can occur. Strong emotions, let's see, high altitudes, a brain tumor injury, again, where it's messing with the respiratory centers in the brainstem, can all cause hyperventilation. And something you may have heard of to help this would be breathing into a bag. And I guess most studies advise against this, but you can see why it would be helpful. Why would it be helpful to breathe into a bag? Well, it'd be helpful because, you're breathing CO2 out, but you're also breathing that CO2 in. So it works to elevate CO2 levels, shift this equation to the right, and get those hydrogen ions back where they need to be. But instead of breathing into a bag, I guess the more preferable thing to do is to stay calm, stay deliberate, and try to calm yourself down and to breathe slowly. So the last way that the body can regulate pH balance is through renal mechanisms or through the kidneys. And as I mentioned earlier, the kidneys are the most powerful buffering system in the body. They can really swing pH in large amounts if they need to. But they do take time. They take hours or days to work. On top of that, only the kidneys can rid the body of acids that are generated through cellular metabolism, like phosphoric acid, lactic acids, as well as ketone bodies. And another important part of the kidneys, what they can do is they can renew chemical buffers in the blood. So the kidneys are an extremely important way to regulate pH balance, but again, they take a little while to kick in. So the most important renal mechanism for regulating acid-base balance involves adjusting the amount of bicarbonate in the blood. And so let's look at this figure down here to explain this. We haven't talked about the kidneys yet, but what happens is blood moves into the kidneys, and blood is filtered out of the kidneys through millions of these tiny structures called nephrons. And so fluid moves into the nephrons, becomes a fluid called filtrate, and that's what we're looking at here. These nephrons are tubes. This is the lumen of the tube. So this is where the filtrate is passing through, and these are the cells that form the borders of the tube. So anything that moves through this tube, all the way through this tube, is eventually going to become urine. But what the kidneys can do is they can take substances that are part of this filtrate, and they can move that back into the blood. And we call that reabsorption. And that's how the kidneys are going to regulate pH balance. What they can do, here you see you have bicarbonate in the filtrate, in these renal tubules, in these nephrons, and they can move that bicarbonate. It's kind of an indirect process. Gets converted to water and CO2, then it moves inside this the wall of this renal tubule. It gets converted back to bicarbonate, and then this bicarbonate can be transported into the blood. And that's the really important part here, is that the kidneys, if they want to, can take this bicarbonate and move that into the blood. And what's a situation that the kidneys would do that in? Would they do that during acidic or basic conditions? When would the kidneys take bicarbonate and increase the level of bicarbonate in the blood? Well, the answer to that is during acidic conditions. During acidic conditions, you have too high levels of hydrogen ion, so the kidneys are going to increase the level of bicarbonate in the blood. That's going to shift the equation to the left, and that excess bicarbonate is going to be able to tie up that free hydrogen ion and again convert it to water, and that's going to bring pH back to where it needs to be. When anything other than CO2 levels from the respiratory system cause abnormalities of acid-base balance, it's called metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis. And metabolic acidosis is much more common than alkalosis, so let's take a look at this. Let's see. So these are all different ways that metabolic acidosis can occur. With severe diarrhea, you're getting rid of too many bicarbonate ions through the feces, and that can cause the body to become acidic. Renal failure prevents the kidneys from ridding the body of acids from these metabolic processes. These two are kind of the same situation here. With untreated diabetes, the cells can't use glucose, so instead they use fats instead, and they produce ketone bodies or ketone acids as a result of that, and that can cause the body to become acidic. The same thing happens during starvation, where the cells don't have enough fuel, so they use fat reserves and proteins, and that produces ketone bodies, acidic ketones at the same time, so it causes the body to become acidic. So these are all different causes, all different examples, or all different causes of metabolic acidosis. And so you have low blood pH levels because of these imbalances. Here are some of the symptoms of metabolic acidosis. And if you have metabolic acidosis, and let's just say that you have kidney failure, what can the body do to try to correct that? Well, this is where the respiratory system is going to kick in to try to help the problem. And if you have high levels of hydrogen ion or other acids, what can the respiratory system do to get rid of those hydrogen ions? Yes, we're going to change respiratory rate and depth, but how are we going to do that? Well, respiratory rate and depth during metabolic acidosis are going to be intentionally elevated. And by doing so, we're getting rid of CO2 from the body at a higher rate, which means the levels of CO2 in the body go down. That's going to shift the equation to the left. Free hydrogen is going to be bound up with bicarbonate, and it's going to be converted to water. And that's going to help bring the pH down where it needs to be. Sorry, bring the pH back up to where it needs to be. And, if you're in a hospital or in another situation where somebody is hyperventilating from an unknown cause, then, there's a good chance that it could be metabolic acidosis. And then, like I said, metabolic alkalosis is much less common, but here are some of the causes of that, and I'll let you read about that.